On the scorching afternoon of 6 July 371 BC, the plains of Leuctra lay silent beneath a heavy Boeotian sun. Dust hung motionless in the air, stirred only by the slow march of bronze-clad warriors taking their positions for a battle that would rewrite the nature of ancient warfare. At that moment, no Greek soldier doubted who would triumph. Sparta, undefeated in a century of hoplite combat, stood confident as ever. Their legendary phalanx, drilled from childhood, forged through terror and discipline, was considered the single most unstoppable formation in the ancient world. Opposing them stood the Thebans, fewer in number, outmatched in reputation, and lacking the aura of invincibility that Sparta carried like a second shield. Yet on this day, a revolutionary idea, a secret tactical weapon conceived by a single brilliant commander, would not only devastate the Spartan line, but permanently break their dominance over Greece. To understand why the world was stunned by what happened at Leuctra, we must step back into the tense years that preceded the clash. For decades, Sparta had been the iron fist of the Greek world. Their victory in the Peloponnesian War had left Athens humbled and the rest of Greece cowed. Spartan harmosts controlled cities, Spartan troops patrolled foreign soil, and Spartan kings dictated the affairs of the Hellenic world. Their core strength lay in the rigid, symmetrical phalanx formation that relied on overwhelming discipline, not creativity. In every previous war, Sparta advanced with perfect uniformity, crushing disorderly or less trained opponents beneath their heavy hoplon shields and spear points. But in the early 4th century BC, a new power began to rise in central Greece, Thebes. Under the leadership of statesmen like Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes underwent a dramatic political and military transformation. Freed from Spartan interference after the daring liberation of the Cadmea in 379 BCE, Thebes embarked on a mission to restore its influence over Boeotia. But in challenging Sparta, Thebes was not merely provoking a regional bully. They were standing against the most feared military society in recorded Greek history, and everyone knew it. What no one knew was that Thebes possessed a commander who viewed warfare through a radically different lens. Epaminondas, philosopher, general and former student of Pythagorean thinkers, had mastered not only the disciplined tactics of traditional hoplite combat, but also the strategic imagination to break the old rules. He understood something that no other Greek general had ever dared to implement on the battlefield, that asymmetry, not symmetry, could win wars. His belief was simple but revolutionary. If Sparta had perfected the traditional phalanx, then Thebes would defeat it by abandoning tradition entirely. By 371 BC, tensions between Thebes and Sparta reached breaking point. The Boeotian League's refusal to recognize Spartan dominance infuriated King Agesilaus and the Spartan ephors. When diplomacy failed, the Spartans marched north under Cleombrotus I*, whose task was to crush Theban resistance once and for all. The Spartan army entered Boeotian territory, expecting an easy victory. After all, Thebes had never before defeated Sparta in a major pitched battle. Their enemies believed them inferior. Many Thebans feared the same, but Epaminondas had been preparing for this moment for years. The battlefield chosen by both armies was the plain of Leuctra, a stretch of flat, open ground bordered by gentle slopes. Traditionally, such terrain favored the Spartans, whose phalanx operated most effectively on even ground. Warriors on each side began forming their lines early in the day. The Spartans brought along not only their famous Spartan hoplites, the Spartiates, but also allies from allied Peloponnesian cities. Their numbers exceeded 6,000 men, including 700 elite Spartans, whose presence alone was usually enough to frighten opponents into mistakes. The Theban force was significantly smaller, roughly 6,000 in total, with no more than 300 elite warriors belonging to the sacred band of Thebes. Under normal Greek tactics, Thebes would align its phalanx in equal depth across the battlefield, using long rows of hoplites facing the enemy head-on, But normal tactics were exactly what Epaminondas refused to rely on. His decision would shock the entire ancient world. Instead of distributing his men evenly, Epaminondas concentrated extraordinary strength on his left flank, stacking his troops over 50 shields deep. This created the deepest hoplite formation ever seen in Greek warfare. At its core stood the sacred band, an elite force of pairs of warriors sworn to fight and die for one another. The Theban right flank was deliberately weakened, almost inviting Spartan pressure. It was a gamble unlike anything witnessed in the history of hoplite battles, but the secret weapon that would annihilate the Spartan phalanx wasn't just the depth of this new formation, it was how Epaminondas intended to use it. He planned to strike directly at the Spartan right wing, the very heart of their battle line, where the most elite Spartan warriors traditionally fought. Greek custom placed each army's strongest troops on its own right. Epaminondas would do the opposite. He would pit his strongest against Sparta's strongest, something no Greek commander had ever dared attempt. And rather than advancing in a straight line, the Theban left would push forward in an oblique formation, a slanted attack designed to hit the Spartans first before the rest of the line even fully engaged. In essence, Epaminondas reprogrammed the entire logic of ancient warfare. He proposed that a smaller force, applied with overwhelming force at a single critical point, could punch through even the strongest army in Greece. The concept would later influence the tactics of Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great, and eventually European military doctrine thousands of years later. But on 6 July 371 BC, it was an untested experiment that carried enormous risk. As the armies completed their formations, the tension thickened. Spartan commanders, confident in their traditional superiority, mocked the Theban arrangement. They saw the weakened right flank and believed Thebes would collapse within minutes. But they did not sense what Epaminondas had set in motion. His formation was not a sign of weakness. It was a loaded spring aimed at the very center of Spartan power. The Theban cavalry, superior to the Spartan horsemen, moved into early skirmishes, disrupting the enemy's initial cohesion. Clouds of dust rose as the horses clashed, and the Theban riders gradually pushed the Spartan cavalry back into their own lines. This disruption, subtle but crucial, hampered the Spartan infantry's orderly advance. Then the moment came. Epaminondas issued the command. His massive left wing surged forward in a dense, irresistible block of bronze and muscle, more than 50 ranks deep, spear points glimmering under the sun. They advanced not straight but diagonally, smashing into the Spartan right before the rest of the battlefield could react. At their head marched the sacred band, and behind them the entire weight of Thebes bore down like an avalanche. For the first time in Greek history, the Spartans were not facing equal strength. They were facing overwhelming, concentrated power aimed directly at their best troops. The Spartan phalanx, built on the principle of uniformity, could not easily adapt, and in that instant on the soil of Leuctra, the myth of Spartan invincibility began to tremble. The moment the Theban left wing surged into motion, every warrior on the field felt the shift in energy. The ground trembled beneath thousands of synchronized footsteps as Epaminondas's massive column crashed toward the Spartan right. On most Greek battlefields, two phalanxes advanced in nearly parallel lines, meeting shield to shield with equal momentum. But at Leuctra, Epaminondas shattered centuries of custom. His formation was not merely deep. It was a moving fortress of human muscle and bronze that struck the Spartans long before the rest of the Theban line even came close to engaging. Cleombrotus, commander of the Spartan forces, immediately understood that something unusual was happening, but by the time he realized the danger, it was already too late. Standing at the head of the Spartan right wing, surrounded by his elite Spartiates, he watched the Theban left approach not in a straight push, but in a diagonal wedge, the point of which was aimed directly at him. This was the essence of Epaminondas's secret weapon, an oblique attack, a tactic unheard of in Greek warfare. Rather than committing to a broad, simultaneous clash, Epaminondas intended to destroy the strongest part of the Spartan army before the rest could even respond. The Theban formation moved like a battering ram. Layer upon layer of deep ranks pressed forward, creating immense momentum. A normal Greek phalanx, usually 8 to 12 ranks deep, relied on discipline and cohesion. But a 50-rank phalanx generated a crushing physical force, a kind of human catapult capable of breaking any line that stood in its path. At the very front marched the sacred band of Thebes, the elite corps of 300 warriors bound by loyalty, training, and a vow to stand firm until death. Their presence at the tip of the formation meant the strongest, most determined fighters in Greece were leading the strike against the most elite Spartans. The two sides collided with a force that echoed across the plain. Shields slammed together, spears snapped, and bodies were thrown backward as the Theban surge hit with shocking violence. The Spartans, famous for their discipline, held firm at first. They braced behind their large hoplon shields and leaned into the pressure, pushing back as hoplites had done for centuries. But this time, the weight against them was different. Instead of meeting a line equal in depth, they were being pushed by an unstoppable mass. Cleombrotus himself fought near the front, shouting orders as the Theban assault intensified. His guards attempted to shield him, but the sheer density of the Theban formation created an iron wedge that forced the Spartan line inward. The Spartans realized they were dealing with something completely new. This was not the standard hoplite duel of equal sides pressing until one lost cohesion. This was a deliberate attempt to crush them like grain under a millstone. Behind the sacred band, the 50, deep ranks pushed relentlessly. Each man in the rear knew that his job was not to fight, but to add weight, pressure, and stability to the front. The strength of the formation multiplied with every additional rank. The Spartans began to buckle under the immense compressive force. Their spears could not reach far enough to neutralize the compact Theban front. Their deeper ranks were too shallow to provide counterweight. The Spartan right wing, once the apex of Greek military prestige, was being suffocated. Meanwhile, the rest of the battlefield remained eerily unbalanced. The Spartan center and left had not fully engaged because Epaminondas was holding back his weakened right flank. This tactic, another innovation, kept thousands of Spartan allies from joining the main struggle, turning the battle into an isolated storm focused entirely on one crucial point. Epaminondas understood that battles were not won by engaging everywhere. They were won by smashing the enemy where it mattered most. A key factor that magnified the chaos in the Spartan ranks was the cavalry clash that had unfolded moments earlier. The Theban horsemen, more skilled and better equipped than their Spartan counterparts, had driven the enemy cavalry backward. In their retreat, the Spartan horsemen crashed directly into their own infantry line, shoving hoplites out of formation and disrupting the carefully ordered phalanx. Though this disruption seemed minor, on a battlefield where cohesion meant life or death, it was catastrophic. By the time the Theban left wing struck, the Spartan right was already misaligned, leaving gaps and uneven pressure points that Epaminondas's formation exploited with brutal efficiency. As the clash intensified, the battle reached its most decisive moment. The sacred band, pushing through the chaos, managed to strike directly at Cleombrotus. Surrounded, the Spartan king fought with desperation, but the Theban advance pressed harder and harder. Contemporary accounts suggest he was struck repeatedly by spears before falling, mortally wounded. His guards attempted to pull him to safety, but the crushing force of the Theban phalanx left no room to maneuver. The sight of their king collapsing sent a wave of shock through the Spartan ranks. For the Spartans, the death of a king on the battlefield was almost unheard of. It was a psychological blow unlike anything they had experienced before. Their discipline faltered, soldiers hesitated, the entire right wing began to crumble. The 50, deep Theban formation sensed the shift and pushed harder, driving into the collapsing Spartan elite like a tidal wave, smashing through a weakening seawall. The Spartan left and center, held back by Epaminondas's delayed engagement, were powerless to help. They watched in disbelief as their strongest wing, the one that had never known defeat, was being ground into the earth. When the collapse finally came, it was sudden. The Spartiates broke formation. Some fell. Others attempted to retreat. The Thebans surged forward, widening the breach and spreading panic. For the first time in a century, Sparta's undefeated core was not just pushed back, but annihilated. The battle devolved into a rout on the Spartan right. More than 400 Spartiates were killed, a devastating number for a society whose full citizens were already few in number. Among them were some of Sparta's most prominent warriors and generals. The loss was far worse than a typical battlefield defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe. The remaining Spartan allies, now aware that their leaders were dead and their best troops destroyed, began to retreat from the field. They had no interest in dying for a shattered formation. Many fled without offering further resistance, leaving the battlefield to Thebes. The Thebans did not pursue recklessly. Epaminondas had achieved exactly what he intended. He destroyed the Spartan phalanx where it was strongest, killed its king, and shattered the myth of its invincibility. As the dust settled over Leuctra, both armies understood that Greek history had changed forever. For the first time since its rise to power, Sparta had been defeated head-on in open battle, not by superior numbers, not by ambush, but by a superior idea. Epaminondas' secret weapon was not a device or hidden army. It was a new way of thinking about war, a tactical innovation that combined mathematics, psychology, and organization to overturn centuries of hoplite tradition. And its consequences were only beginning. When the dust began to settle over the field of Leuctra, a strange silence spread across the plains. The cries of battle had faded, the thunder of shields had ceased, and the once impenetrable Spartan phalanx lay broken in a way no Greek could have imagined. The sun, dipping lower over Boeotia, illuminated the scattered bodies of Spartan elite warriors, men who were believed to be capable of defeating any army through sheer discipline and moral superiority. But on this day that myth lay dead beside them. Epaminondas, who had commanded the Theban left wing with unshakable resolve, rode forward along the battlefield to survey the results of his strategy. The scale of the Spartan disaster became clear as the Thebans counted the fallen. Over 400 Spartiates had been killed, including many from the most prestigious families of Sparta. This was not a normal casualty count. The Spartiates were a tiny elite caste whose full citizens numbered fewer than 1,000 men. Losing nearly half of the highest-ranking warriors in a single battle was an existential wound. For the first time in generations, Greece was forced to confront the unthinkable truth. Sparta, the so-called master of war, could be defeated by a smarter enemy. But to understand why the consequences of Leuctra shook Greece so violently, we must examine the deeper structure of Spartan society. Sparta's military power relied heavily on the existence of its Spartiates, the full citizens who underwent brutal lifelong training and formed the core of the phalanx. These men were raised in the agoge from childhood, stripped of comfort, drilled relentlessly, and forged into tools of war. Their numbers had already been declining for decades due to rigid citizenship rules, economic inequality, and a series of earlier military losses. Every Spartiate death was a blow to the state. Leuctra delivered a strike that Sparta simply could not absorb. Even more devastating was the death of King Cleombrotus. Spartan kingship was deeply tied to their military identity. Their presence on the battlefield was a symbolic shield, a reminder of Sparta's unbroken line of warrior kings. For a king to fall in open battle sent a psychological shockwave through the Spartan people and their allies. It signaled a rupture in the divine aura of Spartan invincibility, a moment in which tradition, discipline, and reputation proved insufficient against innovation and intelligence. As word of the defeat spread across Greece, states reacted with shock, disbelief, and in some places outright celebration. Athens, long oppressed by Spartan dominance after the Peloponnesian War, received the news with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. Corinth and Argos quietly rejoiced. The smaller polis that had suffered under Spartan control felt emboldened, sensing that the old order was cracking. Even cities within the Peloponnesian League began questioning their loyalty to Sparta. After all, if Sparta could no longer protect its allies or guarantee victory, why should they endure its heavy-handed rule? The Spartan government, upon hearing of the disaster, fell into immediate crisis. The surviving generals hastily ordered a retreat, knowing that remaining on Boeotian soil would result in annihilation. When the battered Spartan army limped back home, carrying the bodies of their dead and the shame of defeat, they were met with grief and confusion. Spartan society valued honor above all things, but it also feared the consequences of military failure. Mothers did not weep publicly for their sons, as Spartan culture demanded discipline even in mourning, but the tremors of fear were felt everywhere. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the reaction was electric. The victory at Leuctra was more than a military success. It was a civilizational breakthrough. For decades, Thebes had been overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, considered a secondary power at best. But Epaminondas' triumph elevated Thebes to the forefront of Greek politics overnight. The Boeotian League now stood as a major force capable of shaping Greece's future. Epaminondas himself emerged as a towering figure, a military genius whose ideas would echo far beyond his lifetime. Historians and philosophers later noted that his tactical innovations marked the turning point between classical hoplite warfare and the more sophisticated strategies of Macedon under Philip Roman II and Alexander the Great. Philip, who spent part of his youth as a political hostage in Thebes, observed Epaminondas' tactics firsthand. The seeds planted at Leuctra would later bloom in Macedonian conquests that reshaped the entire ancient world. As Thebes celebrated, Epaminondas made a decision that would deepen the humiliation of Sparta. He led his army straight into the Peloponnese, bypassing the traditional rules of Greek warfare that advised caution after a major victory. Instead of remaining defensive, he went on the offensive, marching into Spartan, dominated territories, and liberating their subject peoples. The most significant of these liberated groups were the Helots of Messenia, a population that had been enslaved by Sparta for centuries. The liberation of Messenia struck at the very heart of the Spartan economy, which depended on Helot labor to sustain its warrior caste. By founding the city of Messene and fortifying it as an independent stronghold, Epaminondas severed Sparta from roughly half its economic base. The once mighty city, feared across Greece, suddenly found itself without the resources to maintain a large army. Its system of elite warriors, already crippled by losses at Leuctra, now faced collapse due to lack of wealth, manpower, and political influence. The psychological effect of Leuctra rippled across the Greek world. Young men who had once aspired to Spartan discipline now looked to Theban heroism. Philosophers began praising Theban bravery. Poets wrote verses honoring the sacred band. And for the first time in memory, Spartan commands were met with resistance rather than obedience. The general belief that Sparta was unbeatable had been the cornerstone of its power. Once that belief cracked, the entire Spartan political order began to unravel. Allies defected, enemies grew bolder. The carefully constructed aura of Spartan supremacy, maintained for centuries, evaporated almost overnight. Yet amidst all the celebrations, Epaminondas remained cautious. He knew that destroying Sparta's aura was one thing, reshaping the balance of power in Greece was another. Thebes needed not only victory but stability. Epaminondas saw himself as more than a commander. He envisioned a new era in which no single state would dominate Greece the way Sparta once had. His reforms and campaigns attempted to build a decentralized system where power was shared rather than monopolized. But this dream, like so many in Greek history, would be tested by the ambitions of rival city-states. Even as Thebes rose to prominence, Athens grew nervous about a new hegemon emerging in the center of Greece, and far to the north, a rising kingdom watched the shifting landscape with keen interest. That kingdom was Macedon, soon to be shaped into a military powerhouse by a young prince who studied Epaminondas's every tactic, Philip Roman II. Leuctra was not an isolated battle. It was a hinge in history. It showed that rigid military traditions could be overturned by innovation. It demonstrated that tactical creativity could defeat even the most disciplined armies. And it revealed that power, no matter how deeply rooted, could crumble when confronted by a superior idea. But the deepest consequence of Leuctra was yet to come. The destruction of Spartan power created a vacuum in Greece. Into that vacuum would step leaders and armies who would redefine not just Greek warfare, but the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. In the months and years after the Battle of Leuctra, the shockwaves of Thebes' victory continued to roll across Greece, reshaping alliances, identities, and military doctrines. The field where Sparta had been broken did not simply mark the defeat of one army. It marked the collapse of an entire worldview. Every Greek polis from the mountains of Thessaly to the islands of the Aegean understood that something fundamental had shifted. The old order, built on the iron discipline of Sparta, had been overturned by an idea that no one had expected. The secret weapon that annihilated the Spartan Phalanx was not a physical device or hidden army. It was the oblique order, a revolutionary tactic built on mathematics, psychology, and the understanding that battles are won by attacking the most important point rather than the entire line equally. Epaminondas had taken the traditional phalanx, which for centuries had relied on symmetry and uniform depth, and reshaped it into a spearhead capable of overwhelming even the strongest enemy formation. This tactic was not merely a battlefield maneuver. It represented a new philosophy of warfare, one that valued creativity over conformity and precision over brute endurance. In the wake of Leuctra, generals throughout Greece began studying Epaminondas's methods. They observed how he had used cavalry superiority to disrupt the Spartan advance. They analyzed how he stacked his left wing 50 ranks deep while deliberately weakening his right. They marveled at how he concentrated overwhelming force against a single, decisive point. But no one studied him more closely than the young Macedonian prince, Philip. During his time as a hostage in Thebes, he absorbed every lesson he could from the generals who had served under Epaminondas. He observed the discipline of the sacred band, the innovative use of deep formations, and the value of tactical flexibility. These ideas would later form the backbone of the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that combined the depth of Theban tactics with the reach of the long sarissa spear. When Philip returned home and rose to power, he applied everything he had learned to transform Macedon from a peripheral kingdom into a military powerhouse. Thus, the ripple effects of Leuctra extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a catalyst that set Greece on a path toward unification under Macedonian leadership, and eventually paved the way for the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander's victories across Asia, Africa, and the Near East carried within them the intellectual legacy of Epaminondas's innovations. In a sense, every empire Alexander built began on the plains of Leuctra, where the concept of asymmetric attack proved its power for the first time. Yet for all the grand historical consequences, Leuctra also had immediate and painfully human repercussions for Sparta. The defeat exposed deep structural weaknesses within Spartan society. The loss of Spartiates was devastating, and the liberation of Messenia stripped Sparta of the agricultural labor that had sustained its warrior elite. Without helot labor, Spartan men could no longer devote their entire lives to military training. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined Sparta for centuries began to erode. Political turmoil followed. Rival factions argued over how to rebuild the army or whether Sparta should abandon its traditional ways, but the truth was inescapable. Sparta had lost its dominance forever. It would continue to exist, fight, and even win smaller battles in later years, but it would never again stand at the center of Greek power. The glory that had once defined the city faded like the last embers of a dying fire. Meanwhile, Thebes attempted to shape the Greek world in its own image. Under Epaminondas' leadership, they launched campaigns into the Peloponnese, Thessaly, and even the northern lands near Macedon. They established new cities, redrew borders, and promoted alliances that weakened their rivals. But Theban supremacy proved temporary. Unlike the Spartans, whose power had been supported by centuries of discipline and a strict social system, Thebes' dominance depended almost entirely on the genius of Epaminondas. When he was killed in 362 BC at the Battle of Mantinea, the Theban ascendancy began to wither. Greek politics once again became a fractious struggle of competing city-states, but now the entire region was weakened. This disunity created fertile ground for Macedon's rise. Philip Roman, too, used diplomacy, strategic marriages, military innovation, and outright conquest to bring Greece under his control. By the time he died, Macedon was the most powerful state in the Greek world. His son, Alexander, expanded this power into the largest empire Greece had ever known. It is one of the great ironies of history that the downfall of Sparta, a city known for its focus on war, came not from a superior soldier, but from a superior thinker. Epaminondas showed that war was not merely about courage and strength. It was about insight, planning, and the willingness to rethink what everyone else accepted as unchangeable truth. Historians, both ancient and modern, have continued to examine the Battle of Leuctra as a landmark moment in military history. Xenophon, though biased toward Sparta, acknowledged the significance of the Theban victory. Later scholars such as Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Polybius elaborated on the tactical brilliance behind the oblique order. Modern military theorists point to Leuctra as a precursor to the concepts of Schwerpunkt, massed attack, and the principle of concentrating superior force at the decisive point. Napoleon, centuries later, admired and employed similar ideas in his own campaigns. The enduring fascination with Leuctra arises because it teaches a universal lesson about conflict, strategy, and human innovation. Power structures collapse when they stop evolving. Strength becomes weakness when it becomes predictable. And even the most disciplined force can be defeated when faced with an opponent who understands that victory lies not in meeting strength with strength, but in applying force where the enemy least expects it. Today, the battlefield of Leuctra is quiet once more. Olive trees sway where hoplites once stood. The land bears no scars of the carnage that unfolded in 371 BC, yet the echoes of that day still resonate through history. It was here that a single tactical idea shattered centuries of Spartan dominance. It was here that the sacred band proved the unmatched power of discipline and unity, and it was here that Epaminondas, with nothing but intellect and courage, redrew the map of Greece. The Battle of Leuctra stands as one of the most important military turning points of the ancient world. It ended the era of Spartan supremacy, ushered in the age of Thebes, inspired the rise of Macedon, and set the stage for the conquests that would spread Hellenic culture across continents. No other battle in Greek history combined such tactical innovation with such sweeping consequences. And at the heart of it all was the secret weapon that annihilated the Spartan Phalanx, the decision to abandon convention, to innovate boldly, and to strike with overwhelming force at the exact point where it mattered most. This was the legacy of Leuctra. This was the moment the ancient world changed forever.